It is. I need to talk to this FICA guy also who keeps on interfering with my paycheck.
I don't know anything about that. I only eat what I kill.
There you go. I like it.
The true entrepreneurial spirit.
I love it. And I will be there once I retire again. Yeah.
Oh, JP, you've got to take retired the RET from the end of my name. Yeah, that's got to go. I do not fly false colors. Although nobody's really caught it up till now. I think a lot of people, he's old. He might be retired.
He's working on that with ex-helicopter pilot. I was just watching some old videos. Now, I know the Army Chinook, it can submerge the rear tailgate for, can the frogs do it? I mean, I was assuming it was because you guys are amphibious.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, it's like Saturday morning. That means those two
out of them,
great guys full of information you don't want to miss. A veteran show for all veterans. Welcome, Major Andrew White,
salt water,
retired,
you got to rinse the bird.
Marine helicopter pilot, Chuck. Right.
Hey.
Hoorah! And welcome to another day. Yeah, there you go. Hoorah! And welcome to another edition of Kilroy's Conversation. We are broadcasting here live from our studios in Frisco, Texas. We have another fun show where we will be dropping a bunch of knowledge warheads on foreheads. That is our new little fun word to use. It works.
It's right up there with crap ton.
Exactly, crap ton. You know, you listen to Kilroy's Conversation. You know what? Here's the thing. In the military, we have our own language where we can use different words and things that people just kind of like, a football bat, and those things that people don't understand. Military people know exactly what we're talking about. Like,
no clue what a football bat is.
Oh, you got to talk to some Army guys, man.
I try to avoid that whenever possible.
Even though this is a podcast and radio, there are certain things that we need to, keep at least PG-13. But we'll talk about football batting in another show and just Army terms, hey, we got to have fun. I know my Army brothers out there are going like, And
everybody else is going, what in the world is he talking about?
Nah, you'll figure it out. I'll educate you later.
Yeah, that's an appropriate term, edumacate. We do a lot of that on the show.
Exactly.
How appropriate for the Army's birthday.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's get to that, man.
Yeah. It is.
Double happy birthday this week.
Exactly.
You dropped knowledge bombs on my forehead today.
Exactly. We are celebrating the oldest branch of the military, the U.S. Army's birthday.
And the only one that has operated continuously.
Exactly. Our birthday on June 14th, Flag Day as well.
Yes.
Keep that in mind.
Yeah, we had the very first Army Army golf tournament was on the Army birthday and Flag Day.
That's right. I forgot about that. That was a good time. Yeah. Why did you guys choose that date, just out of curiosity, or is that just availability?
So that date also happens to be, that year it had to do with scheduling.
Okay.
But now we are always.
You just wanted to celebrate the Army's birthday.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah.
With all the Marines out there.
Exactly, because secretly every Marine wants to be a soldier.
We do? That would be news to every Marine that I know.
Hey, the Army's there because the Marines need heroes too.
There we go. That was just a dud.
Oh, come on.
That one would have finished without an explosion. It was just a dud.
That was perfect.
That was just a dud. So, and I mentioned, so the Army birthday is out of the cat is out of that bag, but I said double birthday. And my partner in crime went from being a proud armored officer to a member of the Corps of Engineers, which is kind of like being in the military.
Well, actually,
my boy Rob Altman is out there cringing at me right now, going, "What are you talking about?" But talk about that. Talk about the Corps of Engineers.
Well, I'm going to talk to them first, but first I got to get a few little Army little things in there first, and then because it does lead its way into the Corps of Engineers.
Well, let's go.
Right. Well, first of all, the Army was established on June 14, 1776. It was the first branch recognized by Congress.
Yes.
Right? And with that also came two very...
1775.
Sorry, 75. My math is off, it happens.
Otherwise, you wouldn't be the oldest service.
Exactly. The two very important badges that were established that day. Also,
two of the 489 that are authorized for wear on every private in the Army's uniform.
You're talking. Those are patches.
No. patches and badges and ribbons and danglies and fanglies. And my God, you guys look like some South American general walking around.
Hey, that's okay, I mean, it's all good. But these are two very significant ones. The first was, do you know what the first award ever given was?
The Purple Heart.
Yes. It was officially recognized on this day by Congress. Because do you know why?
Was actually originally an award for valor.
Yes, by Washington is what he gave his personal award to which service members. It had the Washington family crest on there, and later, at first, it was just a Purple Heart with the stitching valor on there, and it later became what we know now today was the Purple Heart with Washington's bust on it, and the little red and white crest above it with a ribbon is the Washington family crest.
Oh, you know very nice. I did not know that.
And Washington,
maybe I'll learn that. We're hoping to go to Mount Vernon either this year or next.
Have you not been there yet?
I have not. I am ashamed to say it is on the long list of things that when I was stationed at Quantico, I was like, why wasn't I doing one of these at least every other weekend? I could have gotten 20 or 30 of them in.
I'm going to tell you right now.
I'm embarrassed to say that.
I've been to Mount Vernon twice. Once when I was in 8th grade, and to be honest with you, I don't remember the field trip because any 8th grader, when you just drove however many hours it was.
You were busy checking out the redhead and her pigtails.
Exactly,
Sorry about that, Katie.
Typical,
and just throw that story in. I know you hate it.
Exactly. It's a typical thing to do when you're an 8th grader. But I will say this. The Mount Vernon is hands down, without question, one of the coolest presidential homes you will ever see.
Excellent.
In fact, I'm a little jealous because when I was there 2 years ago, they were under some renovation of the house. So there was a lot of steel girders and different things going on around there to keep it up, which, by the way, Army Corps of Engineers may or may not have had something to do with the repairs and upkeep of the house. But we'll talk about them in a few moments later.
There we go.
The gates to Mount Vernon.
Talking about Bill and Melinda?
No, the gates. Not one time about like the iron gates over there.
The iron gates.
You'll love this.
The iron gates of Washington.
You know who paid for them?
I have no clue.
The great state of Texas. Don't ask me why, which is going to be my question for you. Those gates, they're the Texas gates. There's a part of all over the Mount Vernon that's got significance to all 50 states, but the front gates to Mount Vernon, which are gorgeous, are from Texas.
Interesting. I'm
not sure
know
why.
That.
And we started hearing the story, and then our tour started, so we never got the details on why exactly it is. But it is there. It's very cool. And they have a 4D theater.
Let's get back to...
and the other award is the first combat action badge.
Really?
Yes, that was awarded for any soldier who served at least 1 year in combat during the Revolutionary War.
Interesting.
So those two things were established.
Now, do you know the genesis of all 872 badges, trinkets, and general jewelry you guys put on your uniforms?
But I do know quite a few of them, not all of them. Yes, we do have a lot.
We still haven't gotten to, and we're running out of time in this segment. I said it was a double birthday. So let's talk about what happened the next day.
Next day of it is General Washington established the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in order to survey America. We had no maps.
Interesting.
We had no history. And there were, later on, a couple of gentlemen that you may or may not have heard of, a tandem called Lewis and Clark, that were part of the Army Corps of Engineers.
I didn't know. That's right. You're right. Now I do remember that. Very interesting.
So, technically speaking, the Corps founded what we know of America today and its elements. We would not have the maps, the rivers, the trails, the surveys, all the engineering. Washington knew in order to form a perfect nation, you had to build it.
A more perfect union.
Exactly.
So I want to remind all of our listeners that our armor officer here currently works for the Corps of Engineers.
Yes, proud.
So one of the reasons this is so important, and I guarantee you they did not have a birthday cake at the office this week.
Actually, we did. My office did.
But was it for the Corps of Engineers?
We do. We have a Corps.
Oh, very good.
Oh, absolutely. Are you kidding me? Let me tell you.
Like I said, you couldn't find it anywhere on Facebook.
Tankers we only have 4 friends when you're inside a tank. Yeah. And that's all I've ever had in my life anyway. So,
Chuck. Yeah, but you had to pay 3 of those.
Exactly. and trust me, it's expensive. But engineers, let me tell you, they are a whole new unique breed all into themselves. And let me tell you, they take pride. And in fact, they're the only branch in the Army that's allowed to have their own specialized buttons on their uniform.
How would anybody know?
Oh, trust me, engineers.
You have no idea how much fun and I need to bring you because I've got a buddy who has had given me this great poem that he'd done, and it really mocks the Army's uniforms from that standpoint. So,
which one?
Go on to the next segment. Okay, so we're going to start talking, and we're going to go back, and we've kind of gotten on a little bit of a history kick,
which I like. It's fun.
Well, it's really interesting. I have learned a ton doing research for the different shows that I didn't know. But interestingly enough, we've kind of been bouncing around. So we did D-Day, and the following week we went back 2 years in history.
Midway.
And we did Midway. So now we're going to jump back to 1944.
Okay.
And several days after the invasion of the D-Day invasions, the Normandy invasions, we invaded a small island called Saipan. And we need to throw the map up because Saipan wasn't part of the original battle plan for the taking of World War II. But technology had changed, and we're going to get into that. And Saipan is part of the Marianas Islands, and you may have heard of, most people have heard of the Battle of Saipan, relatively famous.
We all heard about the Marianas Straits and all that.
The Marianas Trench. It is the deepest point in the world. We sailed over it on one of our cruises, and like a goofball, I went out and threw a quarter in it. They said it would take a year for that quarter to reach the bottom, 7 miles down.
Would it actually ever really reach the bottom? I mean, I'm just thinking because, and I know my nerd, they're so dense. I mean, at the weight of it, at some point, it probably just stayed there.
It's just barely moving. So anyway, there were 3 islands in the Marianas chain. The northernmost was Saipan, which was the first one we took, and then Tinian, and then the island of Guam.
Right.
Which is actually the largest of the islands, and certainly the best known today, still a U.S. territory. And I didn't look that up. I don't know if Saipan and Tinian are also U.S. territories, because they list Guam as a protectorate. It is considered a protectorate of the U.S. Anyways, 1944, and we are beginning our push. So on the map, you'll see the red dot, and it's very much in the middle of nowhere. But what it is, and we'll show you a picture as we get through this, the reason we wanted to take this, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the segment. But the reason they made the change is they needed a base for our new B-29 bombers, which was the only point out there that had enough flat space to expand. We had to expand the runway the Japanese had to take that
Now, who did
island.
The expansion? Was that the Seabees or the Corps of Engineers?
Most likely it was the Seabees in that case, because it was all supported by the Navy and most of the Army. So at this point in time, believe it or not, we think of inter-service rivalries now as kind of funny.
Yep.
But back then, these admirals and generals would make decisions that would literally kill American troops over nothing but ego. And it really was a shame. So MacArthur controlled the islands that are to the east of the Philippines. The Philippines is in the bottom, kind of to the left of the map.
Right.
There are the islands of New Guinea. And then below that, there are the Solomon Islands. The Solomon Islands is where Guadalcanal took place. We will talk about that in August as we kind of continue this trend, and we haven't quite figured out. The show's constantly morphing. Do we make this all military history? Do we talk about veteran service organizations?
We do
Any
both.
of our listeners want to chime in?
And then we
to try to create some consistency.
Theoretical ideas.
Yeah, we've got a future show that we are going to talk about because I've actually got a great presentation that Colonel Kennedy did, and we're going to talk about what's going on with our friends in China, but then we're also going to do a little what about China and Russia.
Yeah.
So we're going to do some stuff, and that really talks about what we're going to do in the future. But for now, let's focus on history.
All right.
And it is 1944, and we have crossed the tipping point, although some people will say that by taking the islands of Saipan, we would forever... The outcome of the war was basically determined. It was just a question of how long it would take Japan to surrender, and this would be yet another example of how ferocious the Japanese fought. So if we can throw up the map of the island of Saipan, we will talk about, and this is actually the landing plan for the island, and you can see to the southwest corner of the island, the 2nd and 4th U.S. Marine Divisions and the 27th U.S. Army Division landed and created a beachhead. Now, if you look closely, you can see red kind of concave lines that stretch out for there at the very bottom, and it's probably hard to read on Facebook or YouTube, but you can see the advancement at 15 June, at 18 June, at 21 June, as they started to take the island and march north. Dead center in the middle of the island was the highest point of the island, and that was the point where the Japanese concentrated their defenses. But a couple of fascinating things that had happened. So many will remember the bloody Battle of Tarawa. It was actually a gruesome battle.
Oh, horrible.
And it was one of the battles that led to... So I'm going to do a little bit of our typical tangent, and I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about a Cajun by the name of Higgins. William G. Higgins created the Higgins boat. And I may not have his first name right, but his last name was certainly Higgins.
Yep.
And
hence
he
the name.
He had been... he was known in Louisiana and down in the bayous and stuff, did a lot of business with people in Florida too. But he made a flat-bottomed boat that would travel across the swamps real well. And if you know anything about the swamps, it's not all water. You run up on these little sandbars, for lack of a better term, and you had to be able to get over them, those flat-bottom boats, and literally let them slide right over them, and people could move around the swamp. And people actually lived out in the swamp and did business out in the swamp, and so he kind of serviced that. In the late 30s, a general by the name of Krulak, he was known as Brute Krulak, who would go on to do some rather famous things in World War II and in the Korean War. He was a great, gruff, typical Marine Corps general, and that's why they called him Brute Krulak. His first name was actually Victor. He would rise to the rank of 3-star general when he retired. He would never become commandant, which was the job he coveted the most. But his son, who I've actually met, he'd actually have to look up to you. He's that short. Charles Krulak, a really nice man, was a great commandant for the Marines. Anyway, thanks to Victor Krulak, the Marine Corps started talking to Mr. Higgins and explained to him what he wanted done. And the first thing they did in the traditional landing craft that you see featured heavily in movies like Saving Private Ryan were the traditional landing barge that had the ramp in the front that would drop down, and they eventually realized that was a bad idea. But at Tarawa, the landing craft got hung up on the reefs.
Did not know that.
Yeah, and that just led to a lot of Marines getting killed.
I was going to say, that cannot end well.
That was not going to end well. And they'd fall out of those, and because they'd eventually jump out of the landing craft just to get away from the Japanese fire, not realizing they were jumping into sea surrounded by blood and sharks.
Yep.
One of the things they, other than the USS Indianapolis, they don't talk about in most books. They don't talk about the damage done by sharks, but we lost quite a few guys.
I would sharks. Imagine. I mean, you think about all of the naval engagements out there, and I mean, obviously, blood and carnage all over the water. With Battle of Midway. I mean, who knows how many men on either side were swimming in the water that were probably lives taken because they were probably injured and bleeding by sharks. Probably an untold number of victims,
absolutely,
to shark, and we would not know.
You just don't know. I mean, because they're just gone.
Yep.
Anyway, at Tarawa, they realized that they needed something to help get across the reefs. So one of the things that we did is we created, it was called an LVT, a landing vehicle tracked. And it actually had a tank-like track on the bottom of it, which would actually crawl it, like a tank basically crawls, even when they're going really fast. The function is still a crawl. And they would crawl across the tops of the reef. So we used a tremendous number. Of course, the Japanese aren't stupid, and they adjust too. So you do something here, they do something there. So one of the things that they had done, knowing that southwest corner of Saipan was the best beach to land on, they had marked artillery flags. So the artillery spotters knew the distance once they started to range in on our troops landing. So we lost over 20 LVTs to Japanese artillery fire before these guys could ever get on the beach. It was a rather bloody contest. There were 29,000 or 30,000, Japanese troops, including some naval infantry and naval support people. There were 60,000 Americans who invaded. Mm-hmm. The Japanese would lose 29,000 of them. They would almost be completely typical of the Japanese.
The Japanese mentality, that warrior creed that they had, that, we will fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last anything, death before dishonor was literally.
That was a literal thing to them.
Yeah, it wasn't just a catchphrase. Yeah. It was to go back to the emperor or to your leadership that you had to surrender was the greatest dishonor that you could do in their culture.
Yep. Absolutely. In fact, as we approach this segment, the end of this segment, one of the stories, so we started moving ashore. The Japanese were well dug in like they were everywhere. This goes back to the story of Midway, where had we lost the Battle of Midway, even if we eventually come back, I cannot imagine how well defended those islands would have been.
It would have been brutal.
Absolutely brutal. They were pretty dug in as it was, but for them to have a couple more years to continue, it would have been bloodier and bloodier and bloodier. And this was an absolutely brutal battle as the American troops were fighting farther and farther north. They got to Mount Toptishu, I believe is how it's pronounced, and I'm not doing a very good job with that. But they got down to the point where the defenders on the island realized all hope was lost. They were completely isolated by the American ships, basically blockading the entire island. Yep. They had no hope for survival. And they basically, the commanding general basically led 3,000 remaining troops on one of the largest mass bonsai charges of the war. And sadly, they wound up overrunning multiple American positions, including two entire Army battalions and the better part of a Marine battalion, until they finally literally ran out of bodies to throw in front of bullets. And it was absolutely terrible. In the next segment, we're going to talk about one of the Japanese survivors, and it's actually a fascinating story. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the strategic value of Saipan. Yep. But at that point in time, the really sad part of this that I want to leave this segment with, 7,000 Japanese civilians lost their lives as well. Now, many of them armed with nothing but spears were part of the Bonsai Charge, but thousands of them went to Suicide Cliff and Bonsai Cliff and threw themselves
and we've
to
all
their death.
seen those videos and clips there. It's just, I remember seeing the video of, it's a pretty common video of a Japanese woman. She's wearing the white shirt, the blue pants, and she's got her child, her young child in hand, and her and child right off the cliff.
It is scary what propaganda will do to the human mind.
Yep.
And that is, quite frankly, yes, a political shot at the news media today.
Yep.
So we love taking those shots.
Exactly. Well, we're going to take a quick break.
No break.
Keep going.
No breaks. We keep going.
No
rest
rest for the wicked. I like it.
Yeah, rest for the wicked. We're going to do this the way we have done this in the past.
I like it. We're getting used to the way we're doing things now, but that's all right. It's
so on this map, you can see the tip of Tinian. JP, if you'll go to that next map, we'll show both islands. The two islands are very, very close. As you can see from that map, and there's Tinian. So we would eventually do airfields at both Tinian and Saipan. It would be the 20th Air Force. The 20th Air Force had been created solely for the purpose of flying B-29 bombers to attack Japan, and this invasion was solely done to create air bases for them, because at the time we had not secured, the Philippines hadn't even been invaded yet. Wouldn't be invaded for several more months.
MacArthur had not returned.
MacArthur had not quite returned yet. Now, Guam, which is part of this chain, is just south, so it's just below the bottom of the map, and they would also build bases to fly from there. And of course, this would lead to the story of why we took Iwo Jima, because it was a place for the crippled bombers on their return to land, but it was also a place we could launch P-51s to fly air support. So that was the purpose behind the whole battle. And
now,
we're going to...
Got a question for you, since you mentioned P-51. I unquestionably the most significantly well-known aircraft of World War II. And probably, I would say, the only aircraft that a modern pilot today would say, you know what, I would still fly that, because it's the sexiest plane probably ever created.
Airplane ever.
Hands down. So, I think even some of our Air Force fighter jocks would say, yeah, if I had the opportunity to fly one of those, I would.
Oh, absolutely.
And absolutely. It was... How did that compare to the Japanese Zero?
Light years more superior. Sorry, I'm turning off my reminder here, and it's not going very well.
I'll talk about it.
I'm like, where's the music coming from?
We got a little Jimmy Buffett going on.
Hey, I didn't push the button. The button.
Jimmy Buffett, all right? If we're talking about, great guys that veterans would love to just chill out, hang with.
Yeah, it would be Jimmy Buffett. But no, the P-51 significantly, it outclassed, until the ME-262 came along, it literally outclassed everything. I'm sorry, guys. I don't know what is happening here.
Because the P-51 was ultimately the predecessor to what ultimately is now the A-10. Because the first mission of the P-51 was to be a tank destroyer.
Actually, believe it or not, the tank destroyer, the best-known tank destroyer was the P-47, the Jug.
But in Europe, they used the P-51 Mustangs to knock out tanks. That was one of their...
Again, more often they would use the P-47s, because what they would do would be to mount... They'd take the 650 caliber machine guns out, and they'd mount 20-millimeter cannons under the wings.
Nice.
Yeah. But yes, the P-51 was an incredible plane. It would see service in Korea. It would actually shoot down a MiG-17.
Really?
Although that didn't happen very often.
I was going to say, speed and all that, and altitude.
And again, in our famous tangents, I'm going to go back to telling another story about an autographed copy of a book I have.
Oh, God. The Library of Congress, is starting, we do know a few members of Congress, between us.
Yeah.
You're making them kind of...
So the gentleman's name was James Howard, and he had originally started the war flying for the American volunteer...
The Flying Tigers.
The Flying Tigers, and it was the AAV, and I'm trying to remember what AAV stood for. But they were volunteers.
I know the volunteers.
But they were the volunteers. They were the famous Flying Tigers flying P-40s. All of them were called back once we declared war, which much to Chiang Kai-shek's...
Chennault was the...
Chennault was in charge, General Chennault.
And Pappy
Boyington flew with them for a while.
Yeah, we didn't do a show just on the Flying Tigers, I'm thinking.
It's another great topic.
Oh,
But
what
James
history.
Howard was assigned to fly in Europe, and he was assigned to fly P-51s. But he is significant because one of the other things we love to talk about on this show are our Medal of Honor recipients. Mm-hmm. And he would become the only P-51 Medal of Honor recipient to come out of, to ever, because there was not one in the Korean War. So anyway, let's talk about another gentleman. Let's go back to the battle map right quick, because I want to talk about this. This was an absolutely, the Japanese were brutal and they were cruel, but you had to admire their dedication. And this gentleman really epitomized more of an American-style dedication to the mission. So I mentioned the Bonsai Charge, which occurred, and it's right dead center in the island. If you can see where it says Death Valley, that mountain is the highest point on the island. It was littered with caves, and there was a general by the name of Siego Opie. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. My apologies.
You are, Opie. I'm almost trying to remember hearing that name.
So this battle ended on 9 July 1944. It would be 512 days before the man that would become known as the Fox, who was a Japanese captain who had fought in China, so I'm sure he was probably guilty of doing some bad things, and then would be part of it. He was actually stuck. His ship was torpedoed. Now, this guy had a wild war. He had some stories to tell. He was rescued. He was dropped off on Saipan. They didn't have room on the ship that was going back to take him back to Japan to be reassigned. So he stayed there, and he commanded a medical unit, but he was in charge of it. He was not a doctor per se. So as they were doing the Bonsai Charge, he and about 20 other Japanese soldiers basically get cut off. It's at night. And they realize that the battle is over. And so he starts heading back to the mountains because he is going to continue to fight. And he would continue to fight until the 1st of December, 1945, 3 months after World War II ended.
That's right. I do remember. That's where I knew the name.
And there's actually a book that was written about him by an American who was on Saipan called The Last Samurai. And when he finally surrendered, let me finish the first part of the story. He would eventually collect 100 Japanese soldiers and over 200 civilians. And at one point, one of the commanders, desperately trying to find this guy, literally lined soldiers up 2 meters apart on a width of about 1.5 miles and marched up the island trying to find him, and they walked right past his cave. That was up in this Mount
dense jungle.
But very, very dense jungle, extremely dense jungle. I can imagine this being American volunteer groups. What are we trying to find? We're changing the subject on me.
That's your Flying Tigers volunteer group you're looking for.
Yeah, no, I know what it is. It just has nothing to do with the current story.
But hey, he's helping us out.
He's trying to help
you guys couldn't think about it, so I was trying to help you.
Thank you.
There we go.
That.
Hey, there we go. That's a knowledge bomb or something.
Yeah, it's another tangent. But I can still remember my story. So anyway, the nickname, the Fox. He would obviously be returned to Japan. They interrogate him, but he would, in those 512 days that he conducted guerrilla operations, and there are several fascinating books about the Americans who did the same thing on the Philippines. Some incredible books. In fact, there's an entire fictional account.
Well, the Apache Scouts and some of those guys over there.
the Filipino Scouts, the multiple members of different, usually as onesies and twosies, they got started, but they would eventually find each other. And it's absolutely the fascinating part of these stories. But can you imagine being in the jungle and conducting guerrilla operations, and they survived by stealing American rations?
Small unit tactics can do a whole lot of damage. And do you know who was our father of small guerrilla tactics? Robert's Rangers, the only American general that was complete.
Back in the American Revolution,
was undefeated, and his only military regret was he never got to fight side by side by Washington.
So I thought you were going to talk a little bit about the OSS, and I will share the story that I've actually been through the OSS. That is yet another show. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to honor the Fox because you think about it, and even though, yes, he did a lot of damage, one of the things, because a lot of his soldiers wanted to stand and fight that one final battle, and he said, no, our calling is to protect our civilians. In fact, at one point when he was almost captured, the older and more infirmed civilians volunteered to stay behind, so that they would be captured. They would delay the Americans long enough, and they didn't fight. They just were like, okay, yeah, we're here, but the Americans, not knowing what they had to stop. And it was a delaying tactic to let him get away. Extremely well respected. He would go back to Japan. He would become a successful businessman and then eventually become city councilman in the city that he was from. So, quick sidebar, when he did surrender, he did so with great dignity, and he presented a lieutenant colonel of the Army with his samurai sword.
Really? Wow. That's quite an honor.
That was considered quite an honor, and that lieutenant colonel kept that sword. But the story became, I mentioned there was a book written about him, The Last Samurai. The author of the book found the lieutenant colonel and asked him if he would return the sword. And by this time, the lieutenant colonel was old enough that he didn't want to travel to Japan. But the author took the sword, and again, with great ceremony, returned it to the family, where today it is an honored part of the family. So let's go back to the bigger strategic picture.
Okay.
The 20th Air Force was created for the sole purpose of flying B-29s and dropping big bombs on little people, and they did that with great devastating effect.
Yes,
and let's go to the next pictures. But the greatest effect occurred when and here we see, this is the entire strategic purpose of taking Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, because we when you look at them, other than that, they have no strategic importance. But they were the closest islands, and I was talking about egos. There was a debate whether we should take the Philippines or take Taiwan, because once we had taken Taiwan, we'd effectively isolated the Philippines.
Yep.
And there wasn't much they would have been able to do. But MacArthur wanted to go to the Philippines.
And do you know why he wanted the Philippines?
Yeah, because he said he was going to return.
Well,
MacArthur had been, and his father before him had been the governor of the Philippines.
They owned property almost half of the Philippines at the time. It wasn't so much for military purposes. It was for business.
Yeah.
It wasn't personal. It was business.
A lot of our listeners may or may not know the name, the Enola Gay.
Yep.
And this was the sad thing, is the Japanese had no intention, even with massive firebombing, of surrendering. In fact, the firebombings of Tokyo took twice as many lives as both atomic bombs combined.
And do you know why? Also, part of the reason why, and it had a lot to do with one man, the emperor. What did the Japanese did not view the emperor as human? He was a god, and they were not allowed to even look at him.
Yep.
So much so, when he would ride, they could only see the bottom of the white horse, his feet. They were not allowed to look at him.
Let's throw up that picture of the Enola Gay as we're about to roll into the end of this show.
Right.
But it was from, there we go. There's pictures of the Enola Gay popping up. And their crew.
Colonel Tibbets.
And yes, indeed, Colonel Tibbets loved that. But even first atomic bomb did not bring the Japanese to their knees.
Did not.
It was the second atomic bomb. And here's the thing: the historians who say, "Oh, we shouldn't have dropped the bomb." Yeah, we absolutely should have.
What was the name of the aircraft that dropped the second one?
Fifi. So we're just about out of time.
Right.
We'll have another discussion, but it's a simple math problem why we dropped the bomb. They said that the U.S. would incur at least 250 casualties.
And the Japanese
would have incurred over 1 million. All in, 2 atomic bombs only took 175,000 lives. I know it was horrific. I know it was terrible, but that's a simple math problem.
Yep. Here's the thing about Colonel Tippett, though.
Quick tidbit is we're...
About Tippett? I actually served with one of his grandchildren.
Wow.
And where he's buried. Do you know where he's buried?
No. Is there a book about it that I need to put in my library?
You probably could, but he is buried here in Texas.
Yeah.
In an unmarked grave.
Wow.
He did not want, because he knew the significance of what this event was.
Oh.
He did not want controversy to follow him in his train. So he is actually buried in an unmarked grave, not in a U.S. veteran cemetery. He's in a country grave somewhere that...
In many ways, it's sad that we cannot honor a man who did so much for this country.
That, type thing. So,
because some of the idiots out there would definitely have desecrated his gravesite. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we come to the end of another show. I can't believe how little information I had prepared and how far we stretched it.
Yep, and it is always fun out here dropping knowledge, on everyone over here. So our knowledge, Warheads on Foreheads.
The Warheads on Foreheads, baby.
To another end. So make sure you tune in to next week's show. We will be dropping more knowledge on y'all. For Chuck and I, this hoorah, hoorah, happy Army birthday, happy Corps of Army Engineer birthday, and see you all next week.
All right.
That was fun. I liked it. Yeah, there's a bunch of little cool history.
I was just trying to get you guys the information. We don't know what it means. Here you go.
I don't mind.
That's okay. I heard it wrong. I heard AAV, and I'm looking up AAV, and I'm finding viruses. So, but hey, what a great show, though.
I